Welcome to this session of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. I'm your moderator tonight, Tyson James. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists tonight. Starting from the far end, we have Dr. Joshua Swamidass, information biologist from the Washington University at St. Louis. Then we have Dr. William Lane Craig, who is professor of philosophy at Houston Christian University, as well as research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, and Dr. Andrew Loke, who is associate professor of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. Our session tonight is on new perspectives on the historical Adam. We will go in chronological order, so we will start with Dr. Swamidass, then Dr. Craig, and then Dr. Loke. Each section will be 50 minutes total, and that will include 10 minutes at the end of each session for Q&A. So without further ado, we will start with Dr. Swamidass.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for attending too. I hope this is interesting and enlightening for everyone. My publisher gave me a copy of the book too to give away, so if you'd like that, we'll see who gives the most interesting questions. I'll give that, or who wants it, we'll see. But I'm really privileged to be here with the panelists here, who I have a great deal of respect for. I'm like the poor, lonely scientist. I find myself lost at AAR. I've never been here before. This is a large meeting. It's kind of cool. And I'll do my best to kind of lay the stage today by kind of explaining some of the key propositions in the book I had and what we found scientifically, which I think is really shifting the conversation on origins. But my hope in doing this is, I really can't justify every single claim I'm making here, but I want you to at least know what is being said. It's a lot harder to discuss this if you don't know what's being said. And if you want more explanation of why, hopefully that'll come up in the questions. And I'll try and get through this quickly enough that there'll be a lot of time for questions. My focus on this talk is going to be really on my book, which is The Genealogical Adam and Eve. It came out in 2019. I was really fortunate to get endorsed by really scholars across the spectrum, including scientists that were not Christians, who don't think Adam and Eve are real. None of this is really out there science, even though some of the stuff I'm going to be telling you is really surprising. It's all really well established in peer-reviewed literature. And that's part of why I think this has had an impact, because even though there's one particular theological way I maybe favor, in my book, it actually makes space for other theological approaches too, which I think both Andrew and Bill Craig are great examples of, though certainly not just them. So what's the key premise that I have here? What I argued is that Adam and Eve is entirely consistent with evolution. People mean very different things by those, but let me explain what I mean by that. What I meant is like a traditional reading of Genesis, which might be said how most readers of Genesis over the last several thousand years have read Genesis. I think it's fair to say that they all held that, well, not they all, most did, that Adam and Eve were created without parents, that it was they were relatively recent, or less than 10,000 years ago, we could say, and that they were ancestors of all of us. Now, what's the relative importance of all of those? I'd say if you care about continuity with the historical Christian faith, ancestors of all of us is the most important of those propositions because of the monogenesis tradition in the church, which is rooted in, it really gets crystallized with the discovery of the New World. I might speak a little bit more on that if I have time. Probably after that would be created without parents. It's probably the next most important one. That's still important for not just young earth creationists, but probably more moderates even, to people like Tim Keller and such. And then probably the least important is probably recent. And I think that comes out even in our discussion because all three of the views that we're going to show you, or we're going to be discussing, have Adam and Eve as the ancestors of all of us, but there's going to be a lot of debate about how recent they were and whether or not they were created without parents. Now, when it comes to evolution, all I mean is that we share common ancestry with the great apes, and that our ancestral population for our species was always large. Now, that second one has major caveats to it, that second point, but this has been really, I'd say, what the main things are in evolution. And people pretty much across the spectrum, from young earth creationists to atheists to theistic evolutionists, have generally agreed for the last 150 years that these 5 points cannot all be true at the same time. You following me? That you can't really have all those things true at the same time. You have to pick and choose. So you might reject Adam and Eve in this definition or some propositions of it, or you might reject some propositions in evolution over there. But you can't have all of those things. The basic thesis of my book is that all those people were wrong, and it based on a misunderstanding of science. And in fact, you can have these 5 things at the same time. Now, whether you want to, whether you should, that's a different question to start out with, but just the fact that you can. And I think that's important because of that sense of contradiction, I think what had happened is people started to really feel a lot of pressure, largely, on the Genesis account and how people understood it. And if it's really true what I'm saying here, a lot of the changes made in response to that pressure might be wrong turns. And that's, I think, what the exciting thing is, because I think we can pretty definitively show scientifically that they were wrong. They had misunderstanding the science. And so there's a value to go back and see what was lost that maybe we didn't, or what was revised we didn't really need to revise or lose. So how does this work? There is historical theology in here. My book really spans from science to historical theology to a lot more stuff in there too. And that way it's a very genre-spanning book. But what I would say is the traditional account, the historical account, how most readers of Genesis read it, is that we all come from Adam and Eve, but then everyone alive today in our current theological era descends from Adam and Eve. But in the distant past, there's a big question mark. It gets exemplified in things like, who was Cain's wife? There's these big questions about the distant past. And that was okay. People were tolerant of that. People wondered about it. And of course, one way to read this is to say that there was no one outside the garden and try and take away that question mark. You can do that. I think it adds tension to how you read Genesis. I think it's very hard to argue that Genesis demands this, or even the New Testament demands this, but that's one way to read it. What I'm doing is something different, which I would say is just another case of this. I'm just saying that there were people outside the garden that God created through a providential process of common descent. That's well described by evolution, though evolution isn't the whole story. But then at some point he enters in and he kind of covenantally creates these 2 people in the garden. He's doing something, kind of initiating a new theological era in, and they become ancestors of everyone. And then basically the scriptural or sacred history is really about Adam and Eve and their descendants. And there was other people in the distant past who are also our ancestors. That's a story that science is telling us. It's true, but that's not the focus of sacred history, which is why it's not talked about. And so it really just becomes 2 stories that are true happening at the same time. So why has this become something that a lot of people were surprised by? A lot of it goes back to history too, a fairly recent history. There was a Christianity article a little over 10 years ago that really argued that the genetic evidence demonstrates our ancestral population was never less than 10,000 in the last 10 million years. And therefore, we do not descend from Adam and Eve. Now, one thing to just kind of give you a preview, one of the scientific components of Bill Craig's book shows that first claim is actually false. The evidence does not go that far back. It only goes back maybe about 500,000 years. I was pretty involved in the scientific work that helped demonstrate that. But it does show that we have an ancestral population size that's a little bit larger. So that's false. So the model he's going to present is something that has Adam and Eve maybe like 750,000 years ago. And there's a question mark about whether or not there was interbreeding or not. The scientific evidence doesn't push you to it. But their ancestors are basically just Denisovans and Sapiens and Neanderthals right there. Does that make sense? But it's an ancient Adam and Eve. I don't disagree with this. I mean, I agree that it's scientifically consistent with the evidence, to be clear. That's not the level of it. But I have different theological sensibilities behind this. Now, my book really explains the scientific evidence for this point, that even if that first point were true, this therefore does not follow. Does that make sense? And so you can kind of see that explained here a little bit. You can see like all these people in the past, and you can see like an ancestral couple that's special because they're the first ones that are dark, right? Dark is better, right? Just playing. They're in the focus rather than in the peripheral vision, right? And you can see there what I did is I actually marked in black those that are all the descendants, but pretty quickly their descendants are interbreeding with the grays, okay? And so, but quickly the genealogical ancestry that's there really spreads across the entire globe. And so even though the population doesn't dip to a single couple, the population of Adam and Eve's descendants still would dip to a single couple. You see that? And what's the focus of Scripture? I'm saying the focus is on Adam and Eve and their descendants. So that population does dip to a single couple, even though our ancestral population is a lot broader. So Andrew Loke is a philosopher who actually recognized that point as early as 2014. He wrote an excellent article on this and really clarifying that. What's that?
I was commenting on his handsome face.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, I got to say that Andrew Loke has been great to work with. He's based in Asia, and it's great to see how this has really become a global conversation. Sometimes we think this is niche, but it's really not. I mean, what I learned as I studied this is that a lot of key questions about race, human worth, and dignity are really wrapped up in the history of this. It's ended up becoming a big part of my book, and Andrew often talks about all the questions he gets from people outside the American fundamentalist context, to be clear. It's one of these grand questions, really, about who we are and where we came from. So it's not surprising that these are things that people are going to care about beyond just the niche American context, too. I also put up John Garvey's book here, too, as well. But the basic idea here is that what I call, in contrast with what Bill is going to be presenting, the very ancient one, is a more recent one. Now, I would probably put Adam and Eve, maybe if I was forced to, somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And there's maybe more archaeological reasons and a couple scientific reasons I do that, because I'd associate Adam and Eve with the rise of civilization. Andrew would put him maybe around 50,000 years ago. And then Bill Craig is much more ancient. So Andrew ends up kind of more of an intermediate position, and the theological concerns that are kind of guiding him there is part of what the discussion is. Like, are those really the right concerns or not? So there is some really cool science here, which I'll get into. One of the big surprising things that we found out is, or my book explains too, is just that just because someone's a genetic ancestor, a genealogical ancestor, that you have physical descent from them, doesn't mean that you're a genetic ancestor. They don't necessarily give you DNA. So you can see here, this is just a diagram. I'm just going to very briefly, I can explain more later. You can see yourself there, and then your parents or grandparents going back. And it's lighter and lighter and lighter as you share less and less DNA with them. But then pretty soon, when it hit 0, I actually colored it in green, in dark green right there. And it turns out that the first examples, that maybe around 4 or 5 generations back, you start to have examples of individuals that are your ancestors that are not actually your genetic ancestors. Isn't that cool? And if you go back 15 or 10 generations, so to be clear here, 10 generations is just around 300 years. The majority of your ancestors gave you no DNA. Isn't that cool? Like, that means over 50%. If you go back a couple thousand years ago, it's like winning the lottery. And of course, we got DNA from some people back then, but the way how it works, DNA works, is just the vast majority of people 2,000 years ago are ancestors of everyone alive today and didn't give you any DNA. Totally counterintuitive. It's because genetic ancestry is different than genealogical. And even the most conservative of people there in their reading, or fundamentalists of reading, has to concede that Scripture doesn't talk about DNA. It's not a concept they had. At most, Genesis is talking about genealogical ancestry, the idea of like parents giving rise to offspring. And these are different concepts in science, and one of the key things that my work does is really kind of parse out what that difference is. Now, I really blew by this really quickly too about the timing involved in this. So as one of the other big surprises is how quickly universal ancestry converges. So a very, very conservative estimate would be that everyone alive in our current theological era of 81, right? About when Jesus, walks the earth, approximately when, the ascension happens, when Paul writes Roman. Everyone alive across the entire globe, including the Americas, including Australia, all of those people would descend from Adam and Eve if they existed even as recently as 6,000 years ago. Isn't that crazy? Now, of course, if they're farther back in time, that's true too. So it's not like the evidence fixes us, it has to be 6,000 years ago. There's reasons to have it more ancient than that, but ancestry isn't one of those reasons. If ancestry in the current theological era is what's important, then if Adam and Eve exist as real people in a real past, as just historical figures, then our best estimates in science is that they'd be ancestors of everyone. And the only way then that science is really pushing on the Genesis, the traditional Genesis account, is by suggesting there were people outside the garden with whom they interbred. And so that really reframes it. And then I think a good way to even explain what the nature of the disagreement would be between me and Andrew and me and Bill and between Bill and Andrew is that we have different theological approaches to thinking about the people outside the garden. But when it comes to the people within that cone of Adam and Eve and their descendants, we're actually pretty closely aligned. That's not where the disagreement is. That by relocating the conflict from Adam and Eve and their descendants to the people outside the garden, that diffuses the stakes, immensely diffuses what's at stake here theologically. Does that make sense? All right. So another way to think about this too is in terms of kind of what's happened in terms of like the higher criticism and the modernist fundamentalist controversies, where really, there was a large part of theological thought that really bought in hard to this idea that science is telling us the nature of reality, and Scripture, maybe about the resurrection and the virgin birth, but certainly about Genesis, that gets all mythological. There's really no reason to see it as real. What this is showing is that maybe that was based and motivated once again by misunderstanding of the science. If a person came here and said they had genetic evidence against the virgin birth, what would you say? Well, either they misunderstand the virgin birth, or they misunderstand DNA, or they misunderstand both of them, right? That's not a coherent. There's many reasons to reject the virgin birth that I can think of that are at least internally logical. I mean, we can reject those arguments or not, but genetics is not a reason, or science is not a reason to reject the virgin birth. I think that's very much true when it comes to Adam and Eve, that a lot of the arguments sound a lot like a person coming forward with genetic claims against the virgin birth. If they really understood what genetics was saying, that's not a plausible argument. Yet you see those arguments pervasive in the conversation over the last 150 years. And what we can see instead is, you can see here at the bottom is like an image of what's going on in the same physical reality that we all share. The same physical reality studied by science, okay? And the same physical reality that religious conservatives have thought that Scripture, or claimed that Scripture is speaking about. But what Genesis is doing is it's really telling us one part of that story, and it has its own terms. It has what's outside the garden is kind of in the peripheral vision. And then what's going on for science is it's telling us the story of evolution, or the story of the people outside the garden, the garden and the origin of Adam and Eve would have been just in a blind spot. We wouldn't really even expect to see it scientifically in the same way we wouldn't expect to see the virgin birth. But it's still happening in the same physical world. And so they can really stand with equal footing, but with maybe different groundings or different warrants behind them. And so I think when I look back specifically at the discourse over the last 150 years between science and origins, it really seems like there was a major wrong turn that happened here based on a deep misunderstanding of what science really constrained or told us about, or maybe an overstatement of what of science said. So I don't have a problem with the scientific account. I would have a problem with thinking that the scientific account is the whole story. Now, this does bring up some really important questions, and these are a place where you can kind of see where some of the differences are. What is the image of God? Now, there is two claims that both Andrew and Bill are making that I disagree with. And I take the opposite view on it. Okay, so I want to mark out what they are, and I want to point out that I only have to be right on one of them. They have to be right on both of them, okay? And so in that sense, what they're presenting, I would say, is like a chain link argument. They need both of them to be correct. And I'm presenting a bit more of a cord of many strands argument, where I just need I need to be right on just one of them to win the argument, okay? So the first question is this: is the image of God unique to Adam and Eve's lineage or not? So for example, could the people outside the garden be in the image of God? If they could be, then it's not unique to Adam and Eve's lineage. You follow me? All right. The next one is a presence of particular capacities or abilities sufficient, not merely necessary, but sufficient for identifying those that are in the image of God. Okay? And so if you're a vocationalist, this, as many exegetes are, you might say that particular capacities are necessary for the image of God, but not sufficient. All right? And really, both of them are arguing yes to that, and I'm saying no. Or at least because I'm trying to present myself in a different way. The reality is I kind of present a large range of possibilities in my book, but I'd say my instinct is to say no on both of these. So I would say that the image of God, there's very poor warrant to insist that the image of God is unique to Adam and Eve's lineage. And so why can't the people outside be in the image of God too? You follow me? And that's kind of what I prefer. And I think there's many exegetical paths to get there. I don't think there's just one. I think there's many paths to get there, and I just have to be plausible in just one of them. And then finally, it's already disputed. Most exegetes reject a capacity-driven view of the image of God. But I think what's particularly interesting, I would say, with the difference between Bill Craig and Andrew Loke is they have different articulations of what those capacities are. And that's part of the reason why Andrew ends up with Adam and Eve at 50,000 years ago. And Bill Craig is at Adam and Eve, 750,000 years ago. Bill Craig probably has a more minimal definition of what a human is or what the image of God is than Andrew. And I'm saying, well, that's all great. That might all be necessary conditions, but it's not sufficient. That's one direction you can go. So either way, you would end up, if you disagree on either point with them and agree with me on either point, then you might come to a much more recent Adam and Eve. And so that's, I'd say, where some of the debate is. And I kind of put the approximate timelines where they are. And you'll see this is where I think this gets very, very interesting, is that what's really going on here from a philosophical, exegetical, theological, scientific point of view is we're working out what the meaning of human is. And that's part of why this is such an important and interesting conversation. And I want to emphasize too, so you can see different definitions of human kind of coming to play. Bill Craig often will appeal to saying we should just take the scientific definition. I just want to say resoundingly, as a scientist, there is no unified scientific definition of what the meaning of human is. This is something that really extends beyond empirical studies in science to really some grand questions about the human condition. We don't have a scientific answer for that. And besides, when you get to things like the doctrine of monogenesis, that's a constraint that doesn't come from philosophy. It's a constraint. It doesn't come from science. It's a constraint that comes from exegesis. It's a hermeneutical claim about what Paul is saying and what those demands are. So I'm much more inclined to take for the purpose of monogenesis, use a more textual definition of it. So why does this matter? This is the last point I just want to make. Even if you don't care about Adam and Eve and you think Scripture should not be taken literally at all or whatever, you should care about this because the story and the concerns here are very tightly wrapped up in the questions of human dignity and worth and race and that history that's really been weaving between science and theology about whether or not we really think that everyone across the globe really is the same type of human that's equally loved by God and the image of God and that sort of stuff. And so there's quite a bit at stake here, and there's a story that's also important as we think about the concerns of justice in our moment. So the historical account, or the traditional account, has always been that humans come from Adam and Eve, with questions in the distant past. The big challenge to it was not evolution, but it was 500 years ago, the discovery of people living on the other side of the globe. Ken Keithley in the audience has written a really excellent article on this, looking at the scandal particularity and Antipodeans, or Antipodeans, I don't know how to pronounce it, the people living on the other side of the globe. All the church fathers were uniform in denying the possible existence of people living on the other side of the globe because they wouldn't descend from Adam and Eve. Of course, we find out 500 years ago that they were wrong. And that really created an immense theological crisis. The conquistadors really quickly argued that, they were committing atrocities. It was horrible what they were doing. And one of the ways they, at least post hoc, justified this is by saying, well, those people over there, they're not even really descendants of Adam and Eve. Anyways, they're just animals. We can do whatever we want with them. Now, AAR comes by and proposes this idea, maybe we just don't all descend from Adam and Eve. And he doesn't do it in that sort of blatantly racist way. He suggests that maybe even Europeans don't descend from Adam and Eve either, and we're all in the image of God, but Adam and Eve are really just the ancestors of the Jewish people. But then what he's suggesting here is that pre-Adamites, people made before Adam and Eve, are explaining or giving an explanation for co-Adamites, people who are alive in our present day that don't descend from Adam and Eve. So that was his proposal. And large parts of the church rejected that as heretical. And the reason why is that they were very drawn to saying that those people over there that we discovered, those Native Americans, really are equal participants with us as fully human beings. That's the motivation, and that's been a big part of the church's voice on this. That's been hollowed out since the last 150 years, I would say. So that's one of the things at stake here, the monogenesis tradition. And I think that also clarifies why what I'm doing is deeply aligned with the historical Christian faith. What I'm suggesting here is that the Genesis tradition or account is really just as people have understood it through the monogenesis tradition, but one of the question marks we can kind of get more insight to from science, that we were just saying that there were people outside the garden that bred into it, but that's in the distant past, in that question mark area. But when it comes to where these debates about monogenesis happen, well, the church was right on this, that we all do descend from Adam and Eve. And that's important, like I said, because it might be a place where we can start to rebuild a common framework to thinking about universal rights and dignity for all of us. And remember that we all are one blood, one family, one race, the human race. So thanks a lot. That's my thoughts, and I'll take some questions here. So I did well. I kept it to around 25 minutes. So we got a lot of time for, and I have more I can share too, but I'd really like to hear what you guys think or what your questions are. Go ahead, Jeff.
So what do you think is the best way to resolve the dispute between you three? So if we're trying to figure out, okay, who's got the best answer, how do you, where is that to be found? What's the path to discovering the right answer here, the closest to the truth?
Well, I think that now one of the things, so what's the path to finding the right answer given that there's a dispute here? Well, I would say that we've very much been in the process of kind of just laying out pieces on the table of what's possible, but it's something that's going to require a lot more people getting engaged and kind of giving their own takes on it. I would say that. I think that type of academic discourse is really valuable and helpful. I think one criteria I think is important is I think we want something that's consistent with mainstream science. But the problem is that all of our views are consistent with mainstream science. So that's not sharp enough. But I would say that all three of these views were seen to be in conflict with the evidence. It's a big deal now that we can say, well, actually, it's not just that there's one way to thread the needle, that there's actually a wide range of possibilities of ways to kind of think through this. So then we need to be thinking about, well, what are the other criteria that we should care about? And I think that's a place where, I think that's an open question. I would say one thing that I think is important as a criteria is I think if we're going to see any seriousness at all in the story, I think we want something that's we want to look for what's most continuous with historical Christianity and how most people read Genesis. I mean, if it's something that's highly discontinuous with that, I think we should disfavor it. Now, you might disagree with me on that. I'm okay with that. I think that I'm not trying to say that just because it's older, it's better, but I would say that when I look at this conversation, a lot of the diversity of views, if you take that razor of trying to find out what's consistent with science and most continuous with historical Christianity, they just start to look like wrong turns. So a great example of this, there's a lot of faithful Christians that would say that Adam and Eve were just mythical people that didn't really exist. That doesn't really rise as a common view until like the last 150 years because of a perceived conflict with science that isn't there. And so what's the warrant for that grand revision of the Christian tradition? I don't see the warrant. Now maybe someone else could, but this has all the marks of a wrong turn historically. So that'd be an example of a criteria that I think we could, can kind of put together and think through more carefully how to apply. But there's going to be other ones too. I think there's a big questions then about, given that science doesn't rule out even Adam and Eve de novo created, how do we think about that? There is also some information in science that doesn't give the hard claim that one of us is wrong, but there's opportunities for, I would say, resonance with findings in science. And is there value there in some of these? So for example, I see a lot of theological significance in the rise of civilization. That's fairly recent. It's within the last 10,000 years or so. Part of that comes from what I read in Genesis. It seems to be talking about the rise of civilization and like the progress of technology. And that's something that happens very, very recently, right? So that's part of what pushes me more recent. And so is that worthwhile? Is there something to be valued there? I think so. I think that gives some sense to understand the nature of the fall and the nature of injustice in the world too, about how it's really caught up in how cities were built. And I see, especially as a scientist living in St. Louis, I see a lot of coherence there. Bill Craig and Andrew, I think, are a little more inclined to see concordance with, I don't mean a negative concordance. I mean, more like I think resonance with the rise of the rational mind and things like that. But to me, that just seems a bit farther away from the concerns of Scripture about I don't see the origin of the rational mind in Genesis. So I think that's a debate to be had. That some of us here might be stubborn. We may not change our minds, right? But there might be a larger community of scholars that might be able to kind of hash through that and figure that out. What are the other criteria? I mean, there's other stuff too I could point to as well, where I think looking for markers of the image of God, I think, is a bit of a wrong turn in this. I think looking for markers of the fall ends up being a lot more productive. So I kind of pointed to the rise of civilization, but you can also see genetically, there's like very good evidence for a really high increase in violence about 8,000 years ago. I have that in my book, and I'm happy to share about that later, which causes like the number of men to women to be around 1 to 17 in terms of that much patriarchal violence happening, or sex-specific violence happening. It's really weird. It's not really explained by any evolutionary theory, except for we can actually just see it there. It's a puzzle that I'd say is resonant with the idea of a fall. So I think these are the sorts of things that I would point to. I don't think the three of us are going to be able to resolve it. I think it's kind of an invitation to everyone else to kind of join in too, and see if we can actually come together and build some sort of consensus on what the right criteria should be. That's a long answer. I hope that helped and made some sense, Jeff. Go ahead.
What's the consensus, or at least the consensus I keep reading, is that the ancestral Homo sapien population developed in Africa, probably northeastern Africa, and from there gradually spread all over. Is that in fact the scientific consensus?
Yes, with some caveats. So first of all, yes, that is. And
what range?
so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So it all depends. So it could be anywhere between 100,000 years ago to about 350,000 years ago. So it turns out there's a lot of debate about precisely how to define Homo sapien. So even if you want to say, well, human is Homo sapien, well, there's not a clear definition of Homo sapien. And so there's debate about that. And if you're going to go to like far more recent times, then the exact location might kind of shift. And it's really not a disagreement that's profoundly about the evidence. It's more of like ambiguity in the definition. Does that make sense? But what I would say is that I think it's implausible to think that that Genesis is speaking about Homo sapiens. I mean, Homo sapien is a very fraught, bizarre term. I mean, Alan Love is in the audience. He might be able to comment on this too. It's not what you might naively think. It is not. You can't draw an equal sign between Homo sapien and human. It's not a well-defined term. And historically, it was a racially defined term too. And so it's what our species is, but species is a very, it really is a loosely used term in this context. There's debate about whether or not Homo sapiens should be considered a distinct species than others. So with all of that, I mean, it can be very true that Homo sapiens arise in Northern Africa and spread across the globe. That could be true, but that doesn't mean we should think that Scripture is telling us that that's the origin of Homo sapiens is where Adam and Eve were. That doesn't make much sense at all to me. I think there's, you could propose that. Some friends of ours at Reasons to Believe propose that. I don't think their position is necessarily in conflict with the evidence, but I think there's an attempt or a misunderstanding there about trying to take a very idiosyncratic scientific term and kind of push it into Genesis where it doesn't belong. I think Scripture is really just about Adam and Eve and their descendants. Does that help answer your question? Or? Yeah. Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious, and maybe this will become clear as from other perspectives as well. But would you suggest like a pre-Adam human and or image of God, or with just that it
Yeah, so this gets to a difference also of maybe how I'm using the word human from maybe the two of them. So though, I mean, I think I'm a little bit closer to where Andrew is. I would say that human is a multivalent term. I mean, this is what the Stanford Encyclopedia says about it too. That's a polysemous term. So it's a term that has many definitions. And I think there are definitely invalid or inappropriate or incorrect definitions of the term. So for example, if I defined human as Europeans and Africans as non-human, that would be a problem, okay? We can rule that out as not scientifically sensible, both on evidence and ethics and several other things, okay? But I do think that there are multiple legitimate definitions of the term. So what I want to do is make sure I'm picking up the meaning of the term that makes the most sense for whatever question I'm trying to address. So when I'm thinking about the doctrine of monogenesis, I think the right definition, is Adam and Eve and their descendants. But that would be a mistake to think that, but if we're talking about capacity, I think that they're all biological humans. So I'm using human in multiple ways, right? And so I think that's the most helpful way to think about this as it's a common utterance that has very different meanings attached to it. And that we make a lot more progress when we're willing to kind of grant some legitimacy to different definitions, but just understand that they don't have to be coextensive in the distant past. I mean, here's another example too. If we discovered Klingons, let's say, next month Klingons land on Earth, or the Vulcans do, right? Intelligent life from another planet, are they human? Well, they're not Homo sapiens. And so if that's what you mean by human, or they're not our species, they're not human. But I think we should be able to fairly quickly come to a general sense that we should still grant them what we call human rights and dignity, right? So in that sense, they are human. Even though, I mean, that's like an example of like a totally different one that kind of departs entirely now from the biology, right? It's more kind of, discussing it from a different angle. And I don't think that means that invalidates other uses of human. We just need to be aware of using the right definition of human for the question we're trying to ask. Does that make sense?
would I be able to ask?
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm curious when in Genesis 1, when there's the reading of the guy created Adam, which that kind of, is that the same person as Adam? And is when he creates in the image of God, is that the individual named Adam, or this maybe pre-Adam species of humans before we?
Yeah, so that gets to so you're asking me to explain kind of what I think about Genesis 1 versus 2. This gets to, once again, another difference between me and these two guys. So they're inclined to read Genesis 1, 26. I think I'm fairly representing you guys too. You get to talk after me too, so you can set the record straight. So they're inclined to read Genesis 1:26 to be referring precisely to Adam and Eve and their descendants. I'm not inclined to read it that way. And I think there's two ways. So once again, I have like a cord of many strands argument. You have to show that both of them are implausible. I think either we could read Genesis 1 as happening chronologically first, and the Adam there is like an archetypal reference to the creation of all of humanity. And then at a later date, God makes Adam and Eve. And so Genesis 1 is not referring to them in the same way it's not referring to us. So of course, we're in the image of God, but it's really talking about kind of like the broad creation first of them and then of Adam and Eve. That's one, to read it sequential. The other way to do it is to say that that it's geographically broad, but it's still referring to the same people. So God made humanity across the globe in the image of God, including Adam and Eve, and then it zooms in Genesis 2 to talk about the story of Adam and Eve in particular. So this sort of reading then doesn't depend on reading Genesis 1 sequentially. It just depends on the idea of Genesis 1 at least referring to a broader group than merely Adam and Eve. Does that make sense? Oh. Go ahead, Ken.
Yes. Josh, always enjoyed getting to hear you. Thank you for presenting so well again. You say that what you're doing is presenting an understanding of Genesis and evolution in such a way that one can embrace and hold to evolution as commonly understood. Question I've got for you, and this is from a layperson, when we look at the way hominids were back, say, like the time of Lucy, to what we see happening among Homo sapiens, or whatever kind of definition we want to use, hypergenesis, right on up to about 500,000 years ago. It seems like there is such an extraordinary amount of change that happens in evolutionary speaking in the blink of an eye, is this something that one can see across the evolutionary scale, that there's lots of species that this happens? Or is this something that, just from the scientific perspective, seems rather unusual and unique?
Yeah, so the question was, when we kind of look at from Lucy, which is about 4 million years ago, to, you could say, the origin of the Homo genus around 2 million years ago, and so on and so forth, like, it seems from a layman point of view that there's been a lot of changes. Is this unique or not? Well, what I want to say with that is that there is quite a bit that is surprising and unique about human evolution that doesn't have that many parallels. One of the things that's surprising and unique is how many fossils we actually have over the last 2 million years in particular. And while you're right that there's a lot of diversity, like Ian Tattersall calls it a lavish diversity, there is actually quite a bit of continuity to the point that some of the most evidence-based papers are arguing that the Homo genus is actually a chronospecies, that it's actually just one species that has been just steadily changing. That's not possible, actually, unless we had that many fossils to look at. So that's surprising. But there are still very surprising things. So, I mean, we see this continuity of forms that I think is very surprising, with an immense amount of diversity that is beyond what we actually see on Earth today. So these are things that are a little bit surprising. We don't actually usually see that in other animals because we don't actually have nearly as many fossils for other animals, if that makes sense. And so that's one issue that's going on there. There's other things too, where, I mean, it is very weird that Homo sapiens are the only subspecies of human that exists till today. So that Neanderthals aren't out there. So for almost every other species out there, what you'll see is they'll see divergence in the past that continues to this day, right? But humans are weird in that that there was a lot of divergence in the past, but then all that divergence kind of went away fairly recently with the spread of Homo sapiens across the globe. And there was interbreeding and all that, but then there ends up being just really one form of human. And as different as we think we are from one another, the differences we see in extant humans are very small compared to the differences we see in other Homo species. This is very, very bizarre. There's only maybe one or two other species where we've seen anything remotely like this. But this is kind of unexpected. That's not what you would really expect to see. And there's other places where it is weird what's going on with humans, but it does really look like there's like this progression of forms. I mean, and one of the things that was really, I mean, when I wasn't comfortable at evolution, and as I started looking into this, one of the things that actually was the most uncomfortable about learning about all this was just how much evidence there was and how for a continuity of forms. And that's kind of weird. So that's kind of like my brief explanation. And so Bill Craig, for example, would take, I mean, I think both of them would agree with me on this, but they'd be pointing to like potential possibilities of like punctiliar change on particular capacities. And science can't really rule that out. So when we're talking about, for example, the first rational mind, we have no way of saying, you know, what proportion of the species at a particular time has a rational mind. What we could do is maybe say, hey, there's an artifact here. What do you think? Do you need a rational mind for that? We can do that, but this idea of like where there is like a sharp transition, that's kind of outside of scientific view. And so it's possible. And I mean, I'm a scientist. I disagree with these guys. I mean, I agree with them on a great deal, but the places where we disagree are not about the science. And I want to be very cognizant of making that clear. So we understand what the nature of the debate is. It's really more about philosophy, theology, and exegesis, not really the science, because really science isn't determinative on these sorts of questions. Go ahead.
I was late, so maybe the answer to this is, I talked about that already. We're not going to talk about it again. That's fine. But building on the question about humanity from earlier, you give the example of like if Klingons came and we found out they're real, you want to say they're human in some way. I wonder if maybe we're making the word human do too much. Maybe what we're talking about is being a person. Because like for me, I would want to be open to the idea that there's non-human persons. Like I would want to say Worf is a person, Worf is a human. So Do you think that like, is there a reason that you want to load so much definitionally into human versus person? Because like,
Well, it's not about wanting to load. I'm just recognizing the reality that is a lot loaded in that term by other people. And it's like the history, it's a tradition where it's speaking from,
I
right?
just wonder if we could be clearer, especially if we're talking about evolutionary biology. Like, I want to be open to the idea that maybe someday if humanity survives long enough, we would see like non-human persons. Like maybe dolphins get a lot better and we need to like enshrine their rights.
Well, so
Who knows? But like, I wouldn't want to start calling dolphins human if they started exhibiting similar traits. Does that make sense?
yeah, so I mean, so this actually gets discussed in the scientific literature. First of all, on the question of persons, there's actually a growing consensus by one definition of persons that the great apes are persons too. So let's just put that out there. That doesn't mean they have a human mind. I mean, people would still say they're different from us, but that they're persons, and that's actually changing the ethical discussion about the great apes right now. So I'm okay with that. But we have to think about levels of personhood too. I would just add with that. And I do think that people load up a lot on the term human, right? Another way this gets really wrestled with, though, is because there is that discussion that is about humans. So some people, like Ajit Varki down at UCSD, has written a couple papers about the human condition. And it's an important point to observe that that Homo sapiens, us here, are the only animals on Earth right now that have the human condition. And so he's trying to gesture at this idea of like a human mind, right? This, I'm willing to not try to fully define that right this second, but he's trying to gesture at that, that sense of like, there's this thing that we can imagine other animals having, and we see it in literature and in movies all the time, or in Narnia, we see animals with the human condition, right? But we don't see that in our world. That's one of the puzzling things about our world, is that it's only us with the human condition. And to use that and have any meaning in that statement, we have to be open to the hypothetical possibility of humans that are not our species, right? So I think that there's a legitimacy to that type of discussion. And I don't think it's plausible to think that we can police the term of human either, and to get everyone using the same definition. So I think the far more plausible thing to do is just recognize the observational fact that people are using this term to discuss important things, but they're using this term in very different ways. And so we should just want to know what way they're using it there and try and be consistent with that, and then switch to a different one. And talk about in what sense we mean human in this context and what sense we mean it here. And I think that leads to much better conversations that don't actually have that type of word policing quality to them. You know?
Making more of a heuristic move to swim with the current rather than try and fight and be like, oh, well, no, that's actually we should mean this by human or whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to try, it would be fun. It'd be great. It'd be great entertainment to see you try and see the response to it. It would not work because everyone's kind of pretty emotionally caught up on this word. And I mean, like, you basically have to argue that 99% of people out there are wrong and your definition is correct because there's, that's not plausible. That's just not how this is working. I think what's going on instead is that when we're asking what is a human, we're approaching a grand question. And grand questions unsettle simple answers. And the solution is not to back away from the grand question, to maybe go deeper into it. And so I think there's a lot to be done, I would say, in kind of exhuming and making sense of what these different meanings of human are and how they fit together, how they don't. And I think very often in discourse, both in science and philosophy and theology, there's this tendency to kind of do a bait and switch, unintentionally even, where you start with one definition and you kind of make a switch and you're using a different one. And then it just it leads to confusing thinking and senses of conflict or concordance that don't make sense. And I think that there's just immense opportunity there to kind of go think more carefully about our use of the term human in these conversations too. All right. So thanks a lot, guys.